The content of this podcast is based on medical fact and evidence-based practice from credible authoritative sources, but is not a substitute for your institution's policies, procedures, common sense, or good judgment. The views and opinions are those of Eric Bauer and FlightBridgED in their entirety. This is the FlightBridgED Podcast, critical care and emergency medicine education for nurses and paramedics. Here's your host, Eric Bauer.
Hey everybody, Eric back with you. Hope everybody had a great holiday season. We truly apologize for the hiatus. Obviously with the holidays, I've had a lot of family in town, busy with work and just kind of getting the year-end financials all set. So we're back. We're ready for a great 2016 year. Have a lot to put out education-wise. Very, very excited about, the potential opportunities that we're being asked to be involved in throughout 2016. We already have classes right now scheduled through September of this year, which is truly amazing. So I want to really thank everybody for that. Today's podcast is not going to be very long. This is something that I've wanted to put out for the last month, but again, with time and family in town and things like that, just haven't been able to kind of sit down and do this. We actually put out a podcast in, I believe, August. I think it came out August 31st, and it was podcast number 67. And we talked about BiPAP, non-invasive positive pressure ventilation. We looked at hypoxic versus hypercapnic failures and kind of how to deal with those things. Based on BiPAP is one of those things that we really need to be doing more of. I think, all the literature is showing that if we can place a patient on BiPAP, if we can optimize their mean airway pressure, if we can optimize alveolar recruitment and, take care of them in that way, fix the either oxygenation or the ventilation failure with BiPAP rather than intubate these patients, put them on the ventilator, I think we're doing a better service for our patients. So, I'm going to really start pushing BiPAP. I think this is something that not only in the adult population, but for the pediatric population that we're seeing throughout the industry, throughout the world. But one of the things that I think is missed and something that I really hadn't thought of, and it kind of came to my attention by somebody asking me, a flight crew member asking me a question, and it just clicked, or I really forgot to add this into that podcast. Now, if you've already purchased our Ventilator Management or Pre-Hospital Perspective book, I want to thank you. There is a section in that book, and it talks about what we're going to look at today in this podcast. So if you haven't purchased that book, I highly recommend you going and taking advantage of that. And the topic we're going to talk about is really specific as far as what I'm going to talk about today, based on the LTV 1200 and the Revell ventilator. Now, if you out there are utilizing other ventilators, I can't really speak about those ventilators. I will touch on the LTV 1000 just based on my knowledge of it. But I think industry-wide, those are probably the two biggest or most popular ventilators that I come across. When we teach our review classes, I always ask that question, and it seriously seems like 90% of every single class, they're utilizing those two ventilators. Obviously, the Hamilton ventilator is becoming popular, and I really, again, can't speak for that ventilator, but I do believe it falls in line with the LTV 1200 and the Revell ventilator. So what am I talking about? Well, what I'm talking about is how do we set up a ventilator? And I'll kind of start with a quick little scenario. You're called to transfer, let's say, a 55-year-old male patient that has CHF. He's been placed on BiPAP. He's doing very well on BiPAP. He's comfortable. And as you walk in the room, you're told that the BiPAP settings are 15 and 5. So what does that mean? How do you apply that to your ventilator? And again, we're going to look at the LTV 1200 and the Revell ventilator specifically, and we're going to allude to the LTV 1000. So this is a very, very important concept. This is something that is going to help you in managing your patients, and it's going to make your patients much more comfortable when you apply these, techniques. The concept and the terminology we're going to use is called absolute or additive. So what does that mean? Well, absolute. What we're talking about is the difference between the IPAP or pressure support on the ventilator and EPAP and how those things correspond. And if the ventilator is additive or it's absolute. And so when we talk about absolute, what I'm talking about in regards to absolute is I'm talking about usually standalone BiPAP machines. And what that means is that it's absolute. If you are going to put 15 and 5 into your BiPAP machine, that's exactly what the patient is getting. And so that's an important thing to understand. When we look at transport ventilators, and again, I know there's a few services, there's probably a few areas out there that are still utilizing an LTV 1000, but an LTV 1000 is called absolute. So if you want to put a patient, like we talked about in the scenario, if you're told the patient's on 15 and 5, then on your BiPAP setup under the pressure support, which is considered IPAP, you're going to put 15, and under the PEEP, the EPAP, you're going to put 5, and that is absolute. That's exactly what the patient is actually getting. Now, when you look at a ventilator like the LTV 1200 or the Revell ventilator, and this is why this is so important, because both of these ventilators are very, very popular. In that same circumstance, that same patient, if you were to put that patient on a 15 and 5 in an LTV 1200 or Revell ventilator, what they're actually going to get is 20 and 5. Why is that? Because it's additive. And what I mean by that is whatever the patient's IPAP is set at, so it's set at 15, and your PEEP or your EPAP is set at 5, they're additive. And you have to understand in this setup for these two ventilators, that EPAP is maintained throughout the whole process. And the way the ventilator is actually set up, you add those two together. And so what the patient is truly getting is 20 and 5. So let me say that again. In this circumstance, in this scenario, your patient at the hospital was on a 15 and 5. If you're using a LTV 1200 or a Revell ventilator, in that patient, you would not set your IPAP at 15 and your EPAP at 5, because truly what that's going to give you is an IPAP of 20 and a PEEP of 5. Those two numbers are added together, and that's what your ultimate IPAP would be. So you could see that this could be a very big issue. I was talking to one of my colleagues about this, and he had just had a patient. This is kind of how this was brought up. And I said, were you having difficulties? And he said, yeah, actually we were having difficulties. It seemed like it was too much pressure. And that was actually what the patient was on, was 15 and 5. Or I believe it was actually 10 and 5. So the patient, because it's additive, and they were using an LTV 1200, the patient was truly getting a 15 and 5. And they were having a lot of issues with the patient being uncomfortable. They were having mask leakage, which you're going to have issues there. Your patient's going to have increased anxiety. And they also have a big issue with potential gastric inflation, which could lead to vomiting, nausea, and issues like that. So in this circumstance, if you have a patient and you're told that they need to be on a 15 and 5 and you're utilizing an LTV 1200 or a Revell ventilator, what you would actually do is you have to remember that concept of being additive. And in that circumstance, you would actually go a 10 of IPAP and a 5 of EPAP or PEEP. If you added those two together, your IPAP would be 15 and your PEEP would be 5. And so that's called additive. So again, you want to add those two numbers together. That's going to be your ultimate IPAP. So in this circumstance, if the flight crew went into the hospital, they were told the patient needed to be on a 15 and 5, they were utilizing a Revell ventilator or a LTV 1200, they know their ventilator is additive, they would place that patient on a pressure support or IPAP of 10 and a PEEP or EPAP of 5. If you added those two together, they're truly going to be a 15 and 5. And again, how do we know this? Because in a ventilator that's additive, your PIP in that circumstance would be 15. Again, IPAP of 10, EPAP of 5. Those two are additive. You add those two together, your PIP would always be 15. It would never be lower than 15. It could obviously be higher than 15. So the big thing that we have to understand is that, it's really, really essential to these patients to understand this concept. We don't want gastric inflation. We don't want all this air in the stomach. We don't want potential vomiting, because obviously that's going to cause a big issue. If they vomit, they've got a mask on. What if they aspirate? And then you have a major airway issue. Our whole point, our whole goal of using BiPAP is to kind of decrease the incidence of ventilator-associated pneumonia, potential infections. We want to keep them off the ventilator. So it's important to understand this small, simple concept that I think a lot of people misunderstand or they don't really realize or know. So hopefully this podcast is beneficial. Hopefully that you can go out and immediately apply this. If you have any questions on this, please email me. Remember, my email is eric.bauer@FlightBridgeED.com, and I will definitely try to explain it in a different way. Like always, we want to thank you for everything you all do, for just talking about FlightBridgeED, sharing it with your friends, your family members. The growth has been immense. Thank you again for all the support in the recent ventilator book. And if you're looking for a review class, whether that's recertification or initial certification, I believe we have 9 different classes scheduled right now through September, so I'm sure there's a location near you. Check that out, sign up, and hopefully we will see you soon.
This has been a production of the FlightBridgeED Podcast, leading the way in pre-hospital critical care and emergency medicine education.